Welcome to Lesson 2 in the Visual Basic Programming series. In the prior lesson, we talked about how to locate and install Visual Studio 2012 Express Edition. And we took a look around the user interface and looked at certain elements such as the toolbox, the Solution Explorer, and the Properties window. In this lesson, we're going to start to use the integrated development environment in order to create an actual application. Now, our application won't actually do anything when it's done, but what we're going to concentrate on in this lesson is designing a user interface. So we're going to look at using the toolbox that we took a look at in our last lesson in order to actually design a user interface. So to do this, we're going to have to create a new project in Visual Studio, and then we're going to talk about some of these other options here. What's a form, what is a control, etc. after we get our project set up. So let's go ahead and go to Visual Studio, and we can see that the start page is showing here just as we looked at last week. And we're going to go over to the left hand side and click the new project link. You're going to see a list of options. And the one that we're going to be working with primarily in this course is called a Windows Forms application. Now, a Windows Forms application, what that means is we're going to be creating a desktop application. And when we say form in the Visual Basic terminology, what we really mean is a user screen or an user interface element that the user of our application will work with. Down here in the name, we can go ahead and let's just call this Lesson 2. And then we can click the OK button, and Visual Studio will begin creating our project. Now, because we selected Windows Forms as our project type, when the project is done completing here, we're going to see some elements that have already been added to our project for us. For example, we're going to have a default form, as you can see here on the screen, as well as some basic files that have been added to our application. So on the right-hand side, I just want to take a quick look here at the Solution Explorer. I'm going to pin this so we can see that I have Lesson 2 is the name of my solution. I have some properties that I could set for this project. We'll talk at some point about application configuration files. We're not going to use those initially, but this file gets added to each of your Windows Forms application when you create the project. Finally, and most importantly probably, is we do have what is called a form. Its name is form1.vb. Now, by default, when new controls or forms or things are added in Visual Studio, Microsoft will follow this naming convention. For example, this is a form and it is called Form1. If I were to add a second form at this point, it would be called Form2. Now, we really want to give our forms more meaningful names. In this basic application, I'm not going to really worry about changing the name of the form. We're just going to have a very simple application here. But if I did have an application that had 20 forms in it, I might want to make their names more meaningful, such as payroll or user administration, whatever the function of the form was. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and just leave this as Form 1. And what I really want to do is I really want to talk about the controls that we're going to place on the form. Okay. Now, one thing you'll see with this form is it comes in here with this pretty small looking size. We have the option to change the size of our form, and we can do so in several different ways. One of those ways, as you can see along the outside edges of the form, we have sizing handles. If I pull this sizing handle, my form is going to get wider. And if I pull this sizing handle, my form is going to get longer. If I want to affect both the length and the width, then I can use the sizing handle on the corner in order to change that. Okay. Another way that I can change my form is to actually set properties. In the Properties window, and if you don't have the Properties window open, you can press F4 to open it up. And I'm going to pin this so we can take a look at it. So these are all of what they call properties, which describe certain attributes of my form. For example, you can say that Here's its name. It's Form 1. Okay. Well, one of the properties that we can set, if we scroll down here, is we can set one called the size property. I'm going to expand this plus sign, and now you'll see that the width is 570 pixels and the height is 532 pixels. So if I wanted to make this a little shorter, I can just type a value in here, for example, 500. And you saw on the left-hand side of the screen how the size of the form adjusted when I set that property. Similarly, we'll do the same for the width property, and we'll also make it 500. And now I have a square, 500 pixels by 500 pixels. Now, if I adjust the size again using a sizing handle, when I release the mouse, notice how the width and the height are going to change. Okay, now it's 562 and 552. So I have two ways to set properties in my form. I can use the sizing handles, or I can directly set properties. Okay, so this is our user interface form. Now, in order to really make it stand out and actually have it do something, we're going to have to add what we call controls. So I'm also going to pin my toolbox so we can leave these two things open. So what are controls? You can call them widgets if you feel comfortable calling them widgets. They're basically the little widgets or controls that we place on our form or our screen that users will interact with. We'll put buttons where they will click. We'll put text boxes where they can type text. So let's go ahead and just do a very simple example here. I'm going to click on the text box, and holding the mouse down, I'm going to drag it onto the design surface, and then I'm going to release it. Now, this is our text box. If I look at my properties window, you'll notice it's called text box 1. As I mentioned earlier, Microsoft will use this naming convention. If I were to drag a second text box onto this form, then it will be called text box 2, as you can see here. Now, clicking on the control will show the properties over here in the window. So depending on where I'm clicking in the design window, it's going to control what properties are being shown. I just clicked on the form, and so now you can see the form properties are being shown over on the right-hand side. If I click back on text box 1, again, you can see that there are similar properties. So many controls, and if you want to think of it this way, the form itself is actually a control. Many controls share similar properties. In this case, the text box also has a width and a height property. So we can set these in code, or we can do what we did earlier. I can just drag this across, and I can make my text box larger. So maybe I might have an address field, for example, and I want to allow the user to have more space to type. Let's put another control. Let's click on button and drag this one out, and it really doesn't matter where it's positioned at this point. But I want to show you, here's our control, button 1. It also has a size property, and it has a location property, which basically says what is the X and Y coordinates of this button in terms of pixels. So X measures the horizontal, and that would always be measured basically from the corner edge of this form. So it's 252 pixels this way, and it's 288 pixels down this way. So the 252, 288 describes the upper left corner of the button on our form. Now, usually what I would do is I would place all of the controls on the form, and then I would go ahead and I would arrange everything and arrange the form size and make everything look really nice from a user standpoint. You know, at this point, we're just dragging a couple of controls on there, so I'm not going to resize the form just yet. Now, oftentimes, you will want to help users to understand what type of information that they should be providing in these boxes, so we can use another control called a label. And as its name suggests, I'm going to drag one out here, a label will simply describe what this text box is next to it. So, for example, let me click on the label. You can see it says label 1. And I'm going to set a different property this time. I'm going to set the text property. The text property is what will appear in the label. So I will change this to first name. And now you'll notice how my label has changed to first name. I'm going to click on this second box and I'm just going to delete it. And then I'm going to move this button up, and again, we're just doing approximations here, so you don't have to worry about the exact location of this particular button. Mine wound up at 225 and 120, but it's inconsequential. And then what we're going to do is we're just resize the form to make it look a little better, because right now we have all this space on the bottom. I'm going to drag this up into about here. Now, when you're designing your forms, you're going to want to be more exact with your positioning of controls, and we will cover that in another tutorial. But for today, I just want to get you familiar with how you actually take controls and how you place them on a form. So we talked about what a form is and what a control. We looked at using the text box to place controls on a form and for setting control properties at design time. One of the things we're going to look at later in the series is you can actually set some of these properties at what is known as runtime. That is when the application is actually running. Usually what you will do is you will adjust properties based on user selections in your application. So when we're in the design window, as we saw earlier, we can set properties, but we can also set properties in code when the program is actually running. Let's go back to Visual Studio. And now we're going to just quickly compile and run this program to see what happens. I'm going to click here where this start button is, and the start button will actually compile my code. We'll do error checking in that time, and if there's any errors at all, they would appear down in the bottom of the window. And here's my running application. So what you see in the background is the design of my form. What you're seeing in the foreground is the way that the form will actually look to the user. So as a developer, you can actually see the way that your programs are going to look. You can also interact with them. For example, here I can actually type my name into the box. Now, if I click this button, you'll see that nothing is going to happen. The reason that nothing is going to happen is I haven't written any code that will respond to that button being clicked. So that's going to be the topic of our next video when we talk about actually wiring up, as they say, these controls to have certain behaviors.